Hey guys, welcome back to Honkai Star Rail. Today's video is one that I had recommended to me in the comments, and that is to go through all of the beginner 5 stars that you can get from the beginner banner, all 7 of them, and give you some sample teams that you can use with them. So no matter who you pulled, you can sort of have an idea of a basic team structure that you can get away with. Now, I'm not saying you have to use these teams. The game is new. It's fresh. If you want to play a character, play it, have some fun, experiment. Games are about fun at the end of the day, but I just thought in case you are someone who likes to be pointed a little bit in the right direction of what you can use to get through the campaign and stuff like that, then that's what this video is for. Once again, games are about fun, use whatever you want and enjoy yourself in the game. It doesn't have to be a rush. Now, I do also have another team building guide video that I'll leave linked in the description that goes through more of the principles of team building for early and late game, because this is going to be focused at getting through the campaign, which is the early game. So early game, you're looking more at having some elemental coverage in the 5 to 6 units that you want to build, so you're conserving resources, and then you're focusing on surviving, turtling I call it, and not dying, and then slowly breaking your enemies to get that extra damage in. Whereas in the end game, when we look at Chaos Memory, which is the end game mode, it's all about defeating enemies really quickly, so maximizing damage and skill point efficiency becomes more of the play. But this one, once again, we are looking at early game, getting you through campaign, so let's get into it. So kicking off with Bronya. First of all, if you got Bronya, grats, you're pretty well set up. She's going to be used basically as a basic attack spammer because she can advance her gauge forward with her basic attack. She's going to get a lot of those in and generate a lot of skill points. Then if you have a ton of skill points, you can use her skill to boost an ally to give them basically an extra turn and contribute to damage, or also you can use it defensively to get an extra heal or something like that. Then her ultimate is just going to provide nice damage. All round, she's an amazing unit. So if you pull her, what kind of teams are we going to go with? Now, like I said, I like using a bit more of defensive teams in the early game. Once we move to late game, she has some crazy hyper carry teams that she can be worked in. But for the early game, progressing through, if you've just pulled her, something like this will work. Basically, I always like having a defensive support and a healer, and that's what March and Natasha give us. Then I've put Dan Hung in here. Now, the reason I put Dan Hung in here because he's a good single target DPS. However, the one thing that we lack in this team is full coverage. Because Dan is wind and so is Bronya, something that I like having in my early game teams is coverage so that we can always break an enemy. Bronya will actually do a decent amount of break just because she's going to be using so many basic attacks and she's going to cycle through her turns so often. So if we wanted to get some more coverage in this using just the free-to-play units that you obtain, we can throw in something like Serval. Now, Serval is going to give us some lightning coverage. She's also just a really good free-to-play unit that we get along the way. Then we also have the Trailblazer Fire. Now, you get this unit a little bit later on, but once again, filling in that role of the defensive support type unit, and we're obviously keeping Natasha in there. Now, for these positions, you can always swap Serval for basically any DPS unit that you get and you feel like using. Just always try and maintain a bit of elemental coverage so you don't end up in a situation where you really can't break the enemies, because like I said, in the early game, breaking is very important. Next up is Bailu, a fantastic healer with a passive revive. Just keep in mind, if she is controlled, she won't be able to use her revive, so just something to think about. But let's take a look at some sample teams for Bailu. Now, typically there's 2 types of formations that we're going to use in the early game with Bailu. One is going to be Bailu with a defensive support and double DPS, or Bailu with double support and a DPS. So here is a sample team. Now, what I've thrown in here is March with Trailblazer with Dan. Now, this is the physical Trailblazer. The reason I'm doing this is in the early game, it's still worth leveling the physical Trailblazer because once you get up to the Kokolia fight, you need that Trailblazer in the fight when you unlock the Fire Trailblazer, so it's just always going to be worth leveling. So if you need some physical coverage, you can throw that Trailblazer in there. Otherwise, if you want to do more lightning damage, you can always put something like Serval in there because once again, she is a great DPS. Moving on past that, when we look at double support team, you can run something like March and Asta along with your DPS. Once again, I'm just putting Dan here, but you can replace Dan with any DPS you want based on coverage and what you've pulled. So that is that slot there. Now, once again, this team, you can actually swap Asta out again to go back over to the Trailblazer, but once you've got Trailblazer Fire. Trailblazer Fire has amazing break for fire units and just an all-round amazing unit. So you can definitely swap this over to Trailblazer Fire and do really, really well with that sort of defense defensive team. And honestly, Bailu works really well for this because in the early game, I do think it is the turtle strategy where you just try and survive and slowly break the enemies to get your damage in. And Bailu with that res, in case things go really wrong at any certain stage, she can revive the ally and it just adds that layer of buffer to your team that I really like. So that is Bailu. Next up, we have Gepard. Now, Gepard's a funny one for me because he is an absolute beast when we get to the end game. When we look at end game modes like Chaos Memory and stuff like that, his defensive capabilities are huge. However, in the early game, I don't find him quite as useful. I actually prefer something like March 7th for her on-demand shielding, even though it is only single target. Gepard's is tied into his ultimate, so it really relies on him getting a full ultimate gauge, which is hard for him to do because you don't really want to always prioritize his skill because the freeze rate isn't the greatest at base. So once again, I kind of prefer March 7th in his slot, but if you pull him, he is going to be great later on. However, if you do want to use him in the early game, you can perfectly fine do that and you'll probably have no worries anyway. Basically, he's going to replace March in team. So once again, like my staple formations, we're going to have a healer and a defensive support, and Gepard fills that defensive support. Now from there, we can use a double DPS. Once again, we're using Dan and Serval. You can also use Physical Trailblazer. If you pull any of the other luxury 4-star or 5-star units, you can swap them in for these DPS slots. As we move on from that, in the early game, you can even use him with like an offensive support like Asta. Just keep in mind, Asta, I only like her against fire weak enemies. If we don't have enemies that are weak to fire, her attack buff isn't going to stack as well. She's not going to be making use of her insane breaking potential. So she's a bit more of a niche one. But if you have her leveled and you're coming up against fire weakness, she's definitely a great option for that. Then as we move into the other option we have, that is going to be once again the double defensive support with the DPS. Once again, swap Dan for whoever you want in the DPS section, but this is just going to make use of that real turtle type ability. Now, this one isn't quite as efficient as the March Trailblazer because we're doubling up on AoE shields, which once again, Gepard's shield is still massive and still good, but it's sort of diminishing returns on the Fire Trailblazer's effect. So you are losing a little bit. I do prefer March in this team, but in general, it's still a pretty solid defensive team for in those fights where the enemies do lots of damage and you just need to turtle your way through it. Next up is Himeko. Now we have a few extra things to talk about when we look at Himeko because she does serve a pretty decent purpose that some of the other single target DPS don't. So let's jump into the first team that we can look at for the super early game. Before you get Fire Trailblazer, we can once again run that double support, a double DPS. I'd pick Dan Hung in here for my team because Himeko covers our AoE needs and then Dan's going to cover some single target needs as well. We've got 4 element coverage in this team, which isn't too bad. Obviously our physical is weak, but as mentioned before, you are going to be leveling your Trailblazer anyway because you have to essentially for the campaign and you want to because you want to get the Fire Trailblazer eventually. So you can always swap Dan out for the physical Trailblazer early on for some physical coverage. Now besides that, you can do Serval. Serval's going to give you some more AoE coverage as well through the campaign and stuff like that. Next up, we look at once we get the Fire Trailblazer, we can run this sort of team which gives us some really good defensive capabilities. In general, we can mitigate a lot of damage with this team once again, and Himeko is our DPS in this one. We have a fair bit of fire coverage. We are lacking other elements, so just keep that in mind. If they're not weak to fire or ice in this one, you're going to be struggling. You might need to sub some things out. Now we go into a very deep fire team here with Asta. Now, if you're getting into this and you're trying to use all of these teams, you may have built a few too many characters for the early game, but I just wanted to give you as many options as we have. Now, this one's way more niche because for this team, the enemy really has to be weak against fire, but it's not a bad synergy that goes on between these 3 units. We've got defensive support from the Trailblazer. Asta's going to buff our attack, buff our speed, and also buff our fire damage in general. Himeko's technique that she uses outside of battle will increase fire damage received by the enemy. So it just has a bunch of synergies in general, and we can just, especially if it's an AoE fight, you can absolutely collab with this. But this one's a bit more niche, and I wouldn't recommend building Asta if you haven't specifically for this team because you've got plenty of fire coverage with the Fire Trailblazer and Himeko in general. I just thought I'd mention it because it's a nice synergy. Moving on from that, we have Himeko and Herta. Now, you won't see me mention Herta too many times, but these two together form an amazing farming team. Now, depending on their investment, you might be able to just bring these 2 units into battles. When we look at things like if, for instance, if you're trying to absolutely min-max and you're pretty sweaty, you can go ahead and you can kill every enemy in the overworld every day to get the extra experience for your characters, credits, and materials. Now, it's not a must-do thing, but it's something if it's something you want to do, using these 2 units will actually speed that process up a lot. So it's actually going to be some sort of value to those people. And these two synergize super well because both of their passives work really well at just destroying weak enemies. And if you're struggling with just those two and maybe you need some support, you can throw in something like your Natasha. I would just recommend making your Natasha slower than the other two so that they can always do their attacks first and you're not wasting time with Natasha, but she's there as a backup if you need a heal. And then if you're still struggling to clear because you don't have the investment into those two units, you can always chuck something like a Saval in there to get the extra damage. Once again, I would prioritize speed on Himeko and Herta because these two they just synergize so well for farming weak mobs. Now, once again, this is not something I would not recommend everyone to build Herta in the early game. This is just if you're really, really wanting to min-max to the absolute limit and farm every enemy in the overworld. These two just synergize super well for it. Next up, we have my personal favorite 5-star unit, and that is Clara. Now, Clara is a very unique unit. She specializes in revenging. After she uses her ult, she can revenge when allies are attacked. She also increases her chance to be attacked. So she's a damage dealer, but she also wants to be attacked. She gets mitigation, and she has a massive AoE. When she revenges, she applies a debuff to the enemy, and when she uses her skill, she's going to deal extra damage to them. So let's take a look at some of the teams for her. She's pretty much going to be used in that DPS slot. So when we look at two supports, double DPS, I put Dan in there. Once again, you can change this for Saval or any other DPS that you've picked depending on the situation, whatever you're leveling. Like I said, Dan is just a placeholder in that spot. Now, the one thing that I want to mention is the great synergy that Clara has with March 7th, because you can put March's shield on Clara, which further enhances the chance that she will be attacked. Now, obviously, once she does use her ult, she will revenge even if allies are attacked, but that only works for 2 turns. She only gets the enhanced revenge for 2 turns. So keeping the attacks on Clara means she's going to generate more energy because 1, she's getting attacked, but 2, she's revenging, which both generate energy, which means she's going to get round to her ult faster. So still keeping the enemies attacking Clara is going to be the optimal way to play her, in my opinion. So March 7th becomes a great pairing. So for that situation, it would have to be niche situations where the enemy is really weak to fire and stuff like that for me to drop March and bring the Fire Trailblazer, just because I like March's synergy with Clara that much more than bringing the Fire Trailblazer. Then when we move into the double defensive team, once again, we can bring that Fire Trailblazer and March and Natasha, just our real defensive core. And then Clara is our basically defensive offensive unit. And this is a really good turtle team, works incredibly well. You can just prioritize. You don't even have to worry about skills on Clara. You can just prioritize using March and Natasha's skill to keep you topped. And then the others just cover their way. So that is going to be the double defensive teams. And those are the 2 main early game ways that I would be looking at utilizing Clara. Next up, we have Welt. Now, he's the only imaginary unit that we have in the game at the moment, so he is going to be a great unit for coverage. Now, he's a funny type of unit in that he fills both a defensive and offensive support role due to the way he slows enemies and also reduces their gauge, because this can be used both defensively and offensively, like I said, because you take more turns to your enemies, which means you can play it however you want. Now, his damage in the early game isn't crazy, so my preferred way to play him is in a double DPS combo. Like I said, he does have all the slows and everything, so it should allow you to have more time to get your defensive skills in with a March or a Natasha. In this team, when we look at this with him and a DPS and double support. Like I said, you can put Welt into any category, whether you want to put him into support, sub DPS. He's not really going to deal the most damage out of all DPS characters. But when we look at this team, Dan can once again be swapped for any DPS you want, anything you want to build, go nuts. And then March can be freely swapped with the Fire Trailblazer, and you will get the same effect out of this team. But I think this is just a really solid way to play him, and that is my most preferred way that I would play Welt in the early game. Besides that, once again, if you get into a really hard fight, you can go into turtle mode with the double defensive support, but in general, because Welt does provide all that slowing, I think that double DPS is going to be the optimal way. Also, because his damage is a bit lower than some of the other DPS in the early game especially, it might be worth just having that extra DPS to churn through things a little bit quicker. But the turtle method is always going to be an option as well. And last but not least, we have Yanqing. Now, this guy is a really solid damage dealer. He gets the crit buff, so early on where other units won't be critting, he will have more of a chance to crit and just deal that single target damage. Now, the one unique thing about him is he has this passive where it adds a lot of damage, but if he takes damage, he loses that buff, so it's a bit awkward and you want to keep him from ever taking damage. Now there's a couple ways we can go about this. So in this team, once again, we're going on the double defensive support with Natasha and March, and then we're going for the Yanqing and a DPS. I've got Dan in here. Once again, you can replace that with any unit you want. Now, the reason I'm looking at March here is because March can put her shield on him. Now, yes, the shield means he's more likely to be attacked, but in the early game, March's shield is so chunky, it's going to struggle for a fair few units to actually get through that shield, so that can be really effective on protecting him and stopping him from taking the damage so he can keep his buff up. Now, if you swap March with the Fire Trailblazer, let's just jump over here. Now, this is a double defensive team, but in general, if we just have the Fire Trailblazer instead of March, now you can taunt the enemies away from him, but just be careful because if there's any AoE, he's going to get splash damage and then he's going to lose that buff. So Trailblazer without March can work in this team. Just replace March with the Fire Trailblazer. That will work only if you know there's only single target attacks coming at you, which doesn't happen too often. Now, like I showed here, this is the other option you can go into, which is the Turtle team once again, taking all the mitigation. Now, you can stack things in this, like put March's shield on him, then use the taunt from the Trailblazer. Once again, with some of those splash AoEs, the Trailblazer's shield might be enough to protect him, but I wouldn't rely on it 100%. So you could use March's shield to protect Yanqing and then Trailblazer to taunt away as well. But if you are doing that, it means you're running out of a lot of skill points because then you're using skills on March, Trailblazer, and also Yanqing. However, once you do apply the shield with March and the taunt with the Trailblazer, you might not need to use those for the next turn or two, so you can probably avoid spending skill points in the next turn. It's very situational on the situation you're in, and there's no like clear-cut way to play that. But in general, Yanqing, you want him using his skills to maximize his damage, and you want him protected from taking any damage as well, which can be a bit tricky, but in general, it can be done. So that is going to be the end of this video. That goes through all the 5 stars. Once again, these are just some suggestions. You don't have to use this. Play around, experiment. Games are about fun, and you go have your fun. But if you wanted an idea, that is my basic thoughts around teams for whichever 5-star you pull from the beginner banner. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you have an awesome day, and I'll look forward to seeing the next one. Cheers.